Hey, Cypher here, and today let's talk about Marxist historians. Yeah, there's kind of an entire industry of hating Marx, and they spew their hatred all over at anybody trying to teach Marx whatsoever.
See that guy with the red suspenders, driving that car with the bright red fenders. I know he's one of those heavy spenders. Get that communist Joe.
Oh, it's those evil Marxists trying to infect our children. Oh, it's so terrible. How dare they make them read something like Das Kapital and not Mein Kampf, then? Because they're all exactly the same kind of evil, a bloogie woogie woo.
Oh, we're the John Birch Society, the John Birch Society, here to save our country from a communistic plot. Join the John Birch Society, help us fill the ranks. To get this movement started, we need lots of tools and cranks.
Okay, are the red baiters gone so that we can have a serious discussion? Just in case, let me don the appropriate headwear, just to make sure. If you couldn't tell, there's going to be a bunch of Marx in this video, and if you're just going to go to the comments to complain about how evil communism is, go away and let the adults talk, please. Oh, and just as an aside, I had to read both Das Kapital and Mein Kampf. And what's really nice about this version of Das Kapital is that it's abridged by Trotsky, which means that it's a double helping of those evil commies. So, Marxist historians. They exist. What a revelation. In fact, there's so many different versions of Marxist history that I could do about 20 episodes and only hit the biggest names in the field. But E.P. Thompson takes the top of the list because he basically made the best interpretation of Marxist thought about history. Now, Marx and Engels both wrote a great deal about history in their own right, using Hegel's dialectic in a form called Materialism. But I'd never call them historians, just as I wouldn't call Hegel a historian. Engels is actually a lot of fun to read, but a historian doesn't tell their story with a bunch of haphazard guesses, they do so with evidence. And Engels didn't do that. They're philosophers who often make pretty bad historians. Shh, Foucault. You'll get your chance. Just not right now, since Marx is a lot easier than Nietzsche. In terms of philosophers trying to theorize about history, you'll find that any kind of unified idea like materialism never really holds up. That's the thing that all historians understand. History is the graveyard of ideas. No unified theory of history ever works. To quote one of the greats, Charles Beard said, "The philosopher possessing little or no acquaintance with history sometimes pretends to expound the inner secret of history, but the historian turns upon him and expounds the secret of the philosopher, as far as it may be expounded at all, by placing him in relation to the movement of ideas and interests in which he stands or floats, by giving to his scheme of thought its appropriate relativity." So take that, philosophers. History gives us more meaning. I was actually a philosophy minor in undergrad, so yeah. The point is, no philosopher's work is ever useful to a historian as a secondary source. So how do we get from this hairy guy to actual history? There's a number of ways, but E.P. Thompson is probably the best. Before we get to that, though, let's talk about what materialism actually is. It's going to be pretty pedantic, but stick with me, because we're going to get to the actual historical theory after all the doctrinaire stuff. So to Marx, history consists of a series of class conflicts. Each time, a group has power over another group's labor. As Marx says, "To accumulate is to conquer the world of social wealth." So the subordinate group produces commodities for the upper class until the exploitation becomes too much. And then the system is overthrown by its opposition, creating a new system in its stead. This happened when capitalism arose after manorialism and mercantilism clashed, creating a new worldwide revolution. The synthesis of these two systems is capitalism, where the bourgeoisie, which is just French for middle class, has control over the labor class. That labor class is also known as the proletariat. Marx's goal was simply to facilitate the antithesis of capitalism, socialism. After all, Marx says, "Force is the midwife of every old society pregnant with the new one." See, his form of socialism is merely a stepping stone towards communism. There's many forms of socialism, by the way, not just what Marx said. Communism is some ideal utopia where nobody owns the means of production, governments are irrelevant because everything's decided communally, and everybody works according to their ability and receives what they need. But that's all prediction stuff. Historians completely avoid the whole idea of predicting the future, because we all know how dumb that is, from seeing a long history of its failure. And there's entire schools of Marxist thought trying to figure out why Marx and Engels' predictions never came to be, which includes E.P. Thompson himself. Oh, and for those who are counting, here's my score on the Marxist jargon test so far. I think I won a game of Pinko Bingo. Just a few more and I'll control the Eastern Bloc. That requires a shot. Wait a second. We're talking about communism. We drink vodka. Nostrovia. So what does E.P. Thompson add to this mess? Well, not much to the predictive side, but he does allow us to understand a bit of when a class might come to overthrow another. It all revolves around the central concept of class consciousness. Woohoo! What wonderful words alliterated all around. And another for the Pinko Bingo. Nostrovia. So the basic working theory here is that people have to be aware that they're being oppressed in order to protest it, right? Okay, that means that if they're the labor class who are being exploited by their managers, that they have to be aware of that exploitation to rise up against it. So the reason why the revolution never came is that people just weren't aware that they were an oppressed class. E.P. Thompson's goal is just to show class consciousness in history. He was not the first to work towards this. That's probably Georgy Lukács back in the 1920s. Everyone stands on the shoulders of giants. But Thompson's 1963 book, The Making of the English Working Class, was the breakthrough hit for this theory. The book is not about workers and their working conditions. Instead, it's about them becoming aware of themselves as a separate class. In a classic move of Marxist historians everywhere, he begins his analysis by denouncing other Marxists. He says, "There is today an ever-present temptation to suppose that class is a thing. This was not Marx's meaning." Essentially, Thompson is saying that class is an identity, one that has to be formed. So his book is about identity formation. He says, "We cannot understand class unless we see it as a social and cultural formation." You see how significant this is? You see, it's not just pure materialist analysis where you look at people and say, those people are being exploited because of economic inequality in so-and-so way. You can do that kind of thing, but it doesn't answer why revolutions arise. It doesn't actually tell you what conflict is there. Economic inequality is only a problem if people realize that it's a problem. If they're blind to it, then they can't fight it. An oppressed class can only fight its oppressors if they are conscious of themselves. Oppressed people only form a unified identity if they are aware of their own systematic oppression. That's class consciousness. All Thompson had to do was show identity formation. This is simply done by analyzing a class's own words and showing that they are aware of their own plight. This is great for historians because it also humanizes the story. With Thompson's technique, we can use the words of people themselves rather than disinterested statistics. So this gives Marxists a useful tool to find class consciousness. And that's a pretty important tool considering identity informs so much history. Thompson has been so useful to historians that he is often taught as merely being the implementation of Marx himself. He's also useful for other forms of identity formation. Race, class, and gender studies are entirely indebted to the idea of class consciousness.
Also, it's supposed to be vulgar in contemporary discourse to actually say anything that means very much or has any passion behind it. And so you've got to find a new way of writing to do this, I think.
Heck, my graduate historiography classes have all used him as basically the introduction to Marxist history. Numerous Marxist historians such as Howard Zinn and Eric Hobsbawm have dedicated entire books to E.P. Thompson. He remains incredibly influential decades after his death in 1993, even though really all you ever have to read from him is that one book. I had to read both Das Kapital. The synthesis. Man, there's a lot of books in this episode. Brings new meaning to throw the book at them.